Video games are unusual products that differ from other industrial goods in which electrical power, machines, and creative work are integrated. They are an aggregation of a variety of academic disciplines, including engineering, literature, the arts, and psychology, and can be considered a cultural tool for the fun required by society. The game arcades in the late 1970s were the places for boys to play rather rough kill the alien type of games. So I wanted to turn it into a brighter and more fun place where women and couples could feel comfortable going.
That was Toru Iwatani, the creator of one of video games, no scrub that, all of media's most recognisable characters, Pac-Man. Yes, believe that 94% of Americans recognise what this 300-degree circle is, and that makes him more recognisable than both Sonic, Mario, and, well, no, he's still got a few more pellets to chomp before he can take on Mickey Mouse. Regardless, that's not a bad statistic, is it? Just think the entire world of video games are literally beneath this guy. Sure, in more recent years, youngsters will argue whatever crazed obsession they're into will be more popular than Pac-Man, but when that's all over, it always comes back to Pac-Man. Without a doubt, one of the most recognisable shapes in all of video game history. 111 tiny little pixels make up his most iconic shape as it drops you in the middle of a neon blue bordered maze as you take on 244 pellets, running away from the ghost, chasing the ghost, and doing this repeatedly until you move on to the next stage. And of course, don't forget the fruit. Nothing needs to be explained when it comes to Pac-Man, it's simplicity at its most basic form, yet it's pushed the boundaries of what was expected from arcades at the time, and because of that, it captured the imaginations and wallets of everybody who saw it, no matter your age or your sex, and has even to this day continued to stand as the absolute king of all of gaming. But let's not get ahead of ourselves, guys. Let's go back to the beginning and take a look at the gargantuan world that is Pac-Man, where we will be looking into and confirming his origins, his tremendous legacy, his merchandise, and of course, his games. Welcome to Slope's Game Room. But before going ahead, I just want to say a massive thank you for your support. That goes without saying. Right now I'm working on easily the biggest video I've ever worked on since the Amico, so your support, not just the YouTube members and the Patreons, but also the people that subscribe, like, or leave a comment, really do allow me to take the extra time needed to make my videos the best they can possibly be. And also a big thanks to this video sponsor, Red Art Games, who recently sent me Macross Shooting Insight, which is available for the Nintendo Switch, PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 5. Now what you will notice when playing the game is that Macross Shooting Insight is extremely well polished, a game that depending on the ship that you choose provides gamers with the ability to play in multiple ways. You of course have the more standardized shmup style stages in their typical vertical and horizontal fashion scattered throughout your playthrough. You have these over the shoulder type sections which are a nice change up, and best of all you have these sort of twin stick shooter sections, and each of these sections feel completely different to one another. You have your standard shooting attack, you can aim your missiles with the right analog to lock onto nearby enemies. You of course have your screen clearing support strike and the all important evade maneuver, which the more hardcore difficulties will require you to master. In this game you do indeed have your standard arcade mode, but you also have a crazy in-depth story mode that has a ton of Japanese dialogue and text that has been translated into English, so if you like that sort of thing, this will be right up your street. And it's okay, you don't have to watch these sections at all, they're all skippable, it's entirely up to you. On top of the story in the arcade, you also have the Ace Battle mode. This is for the gamers that have mastered the game, and it really isn't for the faint of heart. And then finally you got tons of collectibles and 3D galleries that Macross fans will seriously get a kick out of, online leaderboards for the higher difficulties and replays. So in short, if you're after a new shmup, then click the link in the description and check out Macross Shooting Insight. The year is 1955, and the Nakamura Manufacturing Company, which would eventually be renamed to simply Namco, had just started its long journey down the road of becoming an established entertainment empire after installing a couple of rocking horses on the roof of a Japanese shopping center. The company was started by Masaya Nakayama with the equivalent of only $3,000 to his name, and those rocking horses were just a couple of old second-hand units that Nakamura-san would personally operate alone, welcoming guests, repairing them, polishing and cleaning them on a daily basis. And before long, Nakamura-san started to see a real driving interest in those coin-operated machines. Several already established arcade companies, as well as plenty of coin-op amusement companies, were fully taking over the Japanese market. Nakamura-san was obviously experiencing this ever-growing craze unfold right in front of him, and as he built relationships with several shopping centres and other dedicated family getaways, he started to lease several arcade machines from these companies to put into these establishments. This eventually led to the creation of their own coin-operated Elemeca machine, including the stupidly impressive 1970s Machine Racer, or F1 as it would eventually be rebranded to. But the real interesting part of the company's history piece came a little bit later on in the 70s. You see, one of the newer arcade manufacturers to enter the Japanese arcade space was a little known company known as Atari. Now obviously Atari was very well known on Western shores, with the co-founder Nolan Bushnell pushing it out to everybody he could, and Japan was next, with a little help from Namco. But it turns out that this was harder than expected.
We had real problems in Japan. Japan is a pretty closed market, difficult to get your product in, closed distribution. That's why we did the deal with Nakamura and Namco. He was willing to sort of break with tradition and start working with an American company. And he really made money on Breakout.
And make money he did, but not in the way you would expect. Breakout was indeed the latest and greatest Atari arcade unit, but due to Nolan Bushnell only sending over supposedly 15 units, it wasn't exactly doing all that well, even though everybody that played it seemed to love it. So what was the problem? Why did Nolan Bushnell send so few units? Well, that would be the Yakuza. Yes, you heard that right, the Yakuza, aka the Japanese Mafia. It turns out, unlike other gangs or criminal organisations around the world, this Japanese posse were incredibly versatile and highly intelligent, to the point where they had done quite well for themselves reverse engineering and then remaking the incredibly popular Breakout machines for themselves with incredible speed and efficiency. Whereas Atari and Namco's collaboration was very, very slow, creating the machines and shipping them over took time, and Atari was not willing to let Namco make these machines for themselves, whereas the Yakuza saw no problem in doing that exact thing. This led to Nakamura-san getting caught out, sending his men in to investigate, and eventually meeting up with the head of the Yakuza himself and simply asking them to stop what they're doing. But of course, a deal was thrown back in his face to work together to take hold of the entire Japanese arcade industry, which they no doubt would have accomplished if Nakamura-san accepted the offer. However, he rightfully refused, as there was simply no way that this would end well for anyone besides the Japanese mafia leaders, and with this he went about his way to tackle the issue himself. Tensions were already pretty high between both Atari and Namco by this point, and now Namco had to deal with this. They had to take on the Yakuza. And the way they did that very thing was to beat them at their own game by outselling them. He quickly went to London to meet with an incredibly hungover Nolan Bushnell to explain this predicament and to get as many machines shipped over as possible. But after Bushy's mad night of drinking, he wasn't exactly in the freshest state, and the short meeting at the bar, according to Nakamura-san, was a complete waste of time. Now, just to add a little disclaimer here guys, Nolan Bushnell actually denies that these meetings ever took place. He doesn't understand why Breakout was selling so badly in Japan, and he doesn't remember anybody ever asking him for more units, so believe who you want to believe. Regardless of who you do believe, the counterfeit machines did in fact happen, and to combat this without the help of Atari, what Namco did next would change the course of the company from here on out. They decided to create the machines themselves without the authorization from Atari, just like the Japanese mafia did, in an attempt to outsell the Japanese mafia. So yeah, as Nolan Bushnell already stated, they made a lot of money doing this exact thing. This, among other fights between the two giants, would eventually lead to the odd lawsuit here and there, which isn't what this video is about. This video is about Namco's early days in the arcade business, and even though Breakout isn't exactly the first game they ever made, because you know, they didn't, it was actually a copy of another company's machine, it still led them down the path of creating their own arcade machines, and hiring Toru Iwatani. A young, excitable 22-year-old that joined the company in 1977. He had a keen interest in graphic arts and gaming, but his main passion and the reason he joined the company was to actually make pinball machines and not arcade machines. There was just one problem: the company didn't make pinball machines.
I liked pinball, and I thought I had joined a company which made pinball machines, but the company didn't make pinball machines. So I was quite disappointed. But then I thought, why not make something like a combination between pinball and a video game?
Now this is where that GB game comes into play that I have brought up in the past, and my opinion on that game hasn't exactly changed since then. You know the game Pong, right? You know the game Breakout, right? Well, this is essentially that, with a touch of pinball. A small white dot bounces around the screen, taking out small lines with every hit, and your job is to remove them all. It again isn't really all that different to Breakout, apart from the random bumpers found in the middle of the playing field, just like a pinball machine. And as, well, okay as the game was, it was literally just that. It was just okay. And although it did eventually spawn a few spin-offs and sequels, which are available via the Namco Museum Collection on the PlayStation, its biggest problem was that ball and paddle arcade games were so incredibly common in the arcade space, making this game merely a drop of knockoff cola in whatever sweaty arcade that it found itself in, which was actually, sadly, almost none of them, and because of that, it has become an incredibly rare cabinet to ever find in the wild. In fact, games like this were coming out left, right and centre, so much so that arcade goers were obviously getting quite bored of them. However, in 1978, a brand new arcade game hit the market and it blew everything out of the water, and nope, I'm not talking about Pac-Man. Taito were the guys behind this one, and that game was none other than Space Invaders. Yep, Space Invaders, another game that is one of the most iconic arcade games ever made. A game that you play as an actual game character, I suppose, against 3 different types of easily identifiable pixelated aliens and a UFO, to an ever-increasing heartbeat type soundtrack that quite literally captivated players and still does to this very day. The game became so incredibly popular that some arcades would literally have nothing but this one game several times over. And when it was eventually released in America later that same year, a similar effect impacted all who played it there too. And just like before, crazy amounts of Space Invader inspired games heavily hit production from everyone trying to grab and hold on to that sweet alien pie. And honestly, Namco was no different, but we will cover the game Galaxian another time. It was becoming apparent that if you were clever enough to create something new and innovative for the arcades and you did it right, then that is what you needed to do. And although there were obviously some fantastic innovations during this time that did indeed try something new, the safest bet was sadly to copy instead. However, Iwatani's son, our pinball-obsessed game designer of GB, was actually one of those guys that wanted to do it differently. He was bored of constant space shooting war games, thanks to Space Invaders, that filled every arcade, bowling alley and takeaway that he visited, and decided to look at one of the new innovations that Space Invaders brought to the table that the vast majority hadn't thought about up to this point. It's not about aliens and it's not about the space theme, it's about you, the character that you play as in the game. As basic as that may look, that little shooting rocket at the bottom of the screen wasn't just a moving target, it was a character that you needed to control in order to save the planet. This, and the want to move away from warlike aggressive shooting games, was indeed the seeds of something astronomically special. If he could make a game that had an easily distinguishable character, then not only would it perhaps be something new and exciting, but moving it away from the angry nature of what was popular at the time, it may even invite a female audience to the arcades, which were most definitely dominated by males at the time. Space Invaders also gave another piece of inspiration to Iwatani-san, this time from the developer himself. Because guys, in case you didn't know, the creator and the brains behind Space Invaders actually came from a dream that the creator had one night, and apparently that went a little like this.
Once upon a time, there were some kids in a school being attacked by aliens, waiting for Father Christmas to arrive as the sky filled with rows upon rows of attacking alien scumbags. The desperate children's only means of attack was a laser beam they had built from an old car battery, spark plugs, and a hubcap.
Nope, didn't make that up. Iwatani-san found this concept rather inspirational and decided to base his next game on plenty of classic anime and Western cartoons that appealed to a worldwide audience such as Casper and more notably Q-Taro the Ghost, the story of a chubby ghost who often found himself getting into trouble and eating way too much in the process rather than whatever the latest craze was in the arcades. The idea was to take kanji words from these popular, loved by all no matter your sex inspirations such as taberu, which translates to eat, to eventually come up with the premise for his new game. From this eating theme came the next kanji word, kuchi, which was the shape of a square which ultimately became the inspiration for the character himself. And the very next piece of the Pac-Man puzzle is the one game in fact that everybody in the world thinks they know. The pizza thing. It's often believed that Iwatani-san went out to lunch for pizza, took one slice, looked down and saw what would eventually become the most recognisable video game character of all time. And although that is indeed true to a degree, as I just explained, it was a fair bit more complicated than simply a pizza missing a slice, although it's fair to say that the easiest and most digestible way to market the creation of the game is to say that that was the inspiration for the game. Get it? Digestible?
It's half true. In Japanese, the character for mouth, kuchi, is a square shape. It's not circular like the pizza, but I decided to round it out. There was the temptation to make the Pac-Man shape less simple. While I was designing this game, someone suggested we add eyes, but we eventually discarded that idea because once we added eyes, we would want to add glasses and maybe a moustache. There would just be no end to it. Food is the other part of the basic concept. In my initial design, I had to put the player in the midst of food all over the screen. As I thought about it, I realised the player wouldn't know exactly what to do. The purpose of the game would be obscure. So I created a maze and put the food in it. Then whoever played the game would have some structure by moving through the maze. The Japanese have a slang word, paku paku, they used to describe the motion of the mouth opening and closing while one eats. The name Pac-Man came from that word.
With this idea quickly growing and a small team around him, they decided to move forward with the whole Monster Gobbler idea, but in an attempt to up the Space Invader ante, they decided to change the monsters to ghosts. And cute ghosts, of course, because, you know, females. And to push the idea even further, all four ghosts would have set characteristics in the way that they chase Pac-Man, which meant that the power-up for our poor defenseless circle would be needed to take on these ghoulies. And this inspiration actually came from, and I love that this is a real fact, Popeye. God, do I love Popeye. Okay. Whilst all this was going on, Namco's other team, the ones working on the Space Invader destroyer that was Galaxian, released that game in 1979, and although it wasn't the first ever colour video game, it was indeed the first at taking RGB colour graphics and creating multicoloured sprites. Obviously not a big deal now, but if there ever was a Space Invader killer, then this was gonna be it. Iwatani's son liked this, he liked it a lot. After all, his last game, GB, that gave the illusion of multicoloured graphics, was only able to do this by sticking stripes of coloured cellophane onto the screen. So, he decided to implement this into his new game so that the ghost with different techniques would be easily identifiable, and of course those colours would be softer pastel-like colours so that he could continue to market it towards females and couples. Over the next year, which was an incredibly long time for an arcade game to take back then, the design and recreation of the ghost continued to evolve, and during this time, Iwatani's son's love for pinball grew as 2 new versions of his classic GB game got released called Bombi and QTQ. And it was actually here that we possibly got to see our first look at one of the earlier designs of one of the Pac-Man ghosts, because in the game QTQ, you can actually see 3 pink ghosts at the top of the screen, but slightly redesigned. Anyway, Pac-Man was eventually released on October 10th, 1979. A whole 1 year and 5 months of development went into the game, which again was completely unheard of back then, and the response was, well, it was okay. Space Invaders was crazily popular still, and Namco's very own Galaxian had people queuing up to play it. Pac-Man, however, was a very strange cabinet, often looked at by people that were waiting to play on something else.
The game was taken to a building in Shibuya that no longer exists. It was a thin, chimney-shaped building with 7 or 8 floors consisting of several movie theatres. On the top floor there was a very long, narrow room where the couples, having just seen the movies, would go up to have a little enjoyment before they returned home, so they weren't necessarily gamers. The women and couples were very happy about the machine, very excited. They came up to it and put their hands on it, so we thought that our target concept had been very much in sync and correct. They played it and they were more or less satisfied. They figured out how to play it. It's not a difficult game. On the other hand, the core gamers, the men, were not necessarily very excited about it, but it was for people who didn't play games on a daily basis, women, children, the elderly. It's not like people sat around and played the machine all day though, so we didn't think it would be a major hit. I didn't think that the US and Europe would take it up because it's a rather slow, relaxing game. At that time, what was popular overseas were more thrilling games, and I felt that perhaps the rhythm of Pac-Man wasn't matching the needs of overseas users.
The design was very different from what you came to expect. With its big, mostly white arcade cabinet, the ghosts were named Akabe, Pinky, Aosuke and Gazuka, and this was when Midway got involved. These guys licensed both Galaxian and Pac-Man, and just like they did with Space Invaders, they decided to westernize the whole thing. Firstly, the garish cabinet got changed from white to yellow, Pac-Man himself actually ended up looking even more odd, and the names of the ghosts got changed to Blinky, Pinky, Inky and Clyde. A strange move that, although did help with not only the localization of the cabinet, did raise the question, why didn't they just rename them into their translated names, which were obviously Chaser, Ambusher, Fickle and Stupid, obviously given to them due to the movements that they took when chasing Pac-Man. Oh yeah, there was one other thing that they changed too, the name from Pac-Man to Pac-Man. But why did they do this? Seriously? Are you actually asking that? Have you not seen Scott Pilgrim? Yes, well, for that one person out there that doesn't know, it's a proven fact that all American teenagers are nothing but graffiti tagging rascals. Try picturing the street thugs from Batman Forever for the best portray of these hooligans. And because the bosses at Midway were a tad worried that these dreadful kids would change the P for an F, they decided to change Puck to Pac. Now, hold on guys, do these boomers actually believe that we would have done something like that? Yeah, we definitely would have done that thing. Anyway, When this new reskinned game was officially released as a test cabinet on May the 22nd, 1980 at trade shows, it again got a bit of a lukewarm response. However, after a few final minor revisions involving the game's balance and difficulty, the game finally hit American arcades in July, and my god, did they finally get it right. The world became obsessed with Pac-Man, not just in America, but overseas here in Europe too. The game became so popular that the name Pac-Man even became the norm for Japan too. Iwatani-san's dream of creating a game that would appeal to not only lads who dominated the arcades, but also ladies, parents, grandparents, children and couples, of course, had become a reality. As good as Galaxian was, it was another shooter in a room full of shooters, and Pac-Man wasn't a shooter, and it wasn't a paddle and ball game either. In the beginning, Pac-Man had absolutely no competition. It became a huge hit with over 100,000 machines sold within the first year alone, and by the end of that year, Pac-Man had become a household name. But why? What do you actually need to do in Pac-Man? Well, you're Pac-Man, obviously, and you need to wacka your way through 240 little white dots on a maze-like screen whilst trying to avoid the 4 ghosts. You got Blinky, who will usually take the shortest route towards you, Pinky, who will take a roundabout path to surprise you, Inky with his unpredictable movements, who may come out of nowhere to surprise you, and Clyde, who just does what he wants. If you get hit by this undead creature, then you seriously need more practice. Thankfully, in the corner of each stage are 4 power pellets, which are essentially just slightly bigger white dots, which makes the hunter become the hunted, as Mr. Burns would say.
The adversarial TV cartoon Tom and Jerry helped shape the relationship between Pac-Man and the ghosts. Had the programming been such that the 4 ghosts constantly attacked Pac-Man's present location according to the same algorithm, the ghosts would look like a string of beads. Where's the thrill in that? So I introduced AI-type algorithms that had the ghosts coming at Pac-Man from all directions.
You simply go for as long as you can until all the dots are gone before doing it all again and again and again. Most players will only get to screen 2, possibly screen 3, but the hardcore Pac-Man players of the world, and I'm talking the highest of the high Pac-Man players, will get to see level 256, where the game will glitch out on what is known as a kill screen by us nerds, and the game is over. Yes, you can, in a way, complete Pac-Man, although it's unlikely that you will ever do it or even meet someone that will ever do it. I've never done it. Obviously, as soon as Pac-Man was released in the arcades, the world went crazy for Pac-Man, or as the popular song goes, we all had Pac-Man fever. An absurd amount of toys, clothes, and pretty much anything that could slap a yellow circle onto, indeed, had a little yellow circle put onto it. And as the popularity grew and grew, a stupid amount of maze games started hitting the arcade in order to catch hold of the success that was Pac-Man, as well as plenty of ports making their way to consoles, most notably the Atari 2600 port. Atari was so sure of the game's success that they actually ended up ordering more cartridges than Atari 2600 consoles were on the market. If ever there was going to be a system seller, then this was going to be it. Todd Fry was the guy put in charge of the game's release, with obviously a very limited time to do so, and not so obviously very little help. He was, of course, a brilliant designer, but a designer that did things his own way. This led him to dropping out of school and getting kicked out of his family home, living on the streets before becoming a construction worker, and then somehow through a friend managed to get an interview at Atari to continue on with his coding, which was one of the few things he liked doing back in the day. He of course got the job and was without a doubt one of the oddball characters of the company, barking in hallways and climbing narrow corridor walls, until he accidentally one day cut his head open on a sprinkler requiring stitches. Yeah, Bit of a loose cannon. This then resulted in him getting a bit of a buck your ideas up or you're out talking to from the boss men, and that's exactly what he did, taking on the projects that all others turned down. He was going to port Pac-Man, and he did that very thing by working 80 hours a week for 6 whole months. And he did this on a machine that was primarily designed to play Pong clones and Tank clones. The game that nobody else would touch, he actually did it. Yep, he did it, or an abridged adaptation as he puts it, and as Pac-Man fever was indeed still rampant across the United States when this game was released, it obviously became the best-selling game for the Atari 2600, selling no less than 7.7 million cartridges and earning the gaming giants $200 million in the process. But the company knew that this would be the case. Pac-Man was obviously going to be a big hit, and that's why on the 3rd of April 1982, the day of the game's official release, Atari held 25 events in different cities across America and called it Pac-Man Day. Not only was this one of the first games to ever get a proper release date, even though some retailers had already started selling it weeks before, with the earliest known date being March the 16th, 1982, it was of course also by far the most the company had ever spent on promoting a singular video game to date.
The response was unreal. This is a real craze. We sold them for $34.88, but I think we could have sold them for $64.88.
Unbelievable. We wanted to keep a demonstrator, but someone insisted so violently, we even had to let the sample go. We had a bunch of people ready to break down the doors Tuesday morning.
This is great and all, and for the time, people were ecstatic that they got to play Pac-Man on the Atari 2600, easily the most popular games console for the time. There was just one problem though. Pac-Man for the Atari 2600 was a pretty dreadful port compared to the original arcade unit, of course. And the thing is, Atari knew this, which was why when the game was actually advertised on TV, they didn't show any gameplay footage whatsoever.
First the Pac-Man eats through a maze of dots, then the Pac-Man heads for the corner spot, then he eats his fill of a power pill, and then all those ghosts turn blue, boo, and Pac-Man eats them all too.
Have you played Pac-Man? It's the new video computer game everyone's talking about. And naturally, it's from Atari.
Have you played Atari today?
Pac-Man for the Atari 2600 was a turning point for all gaming media, and this fact doesn't get brought up enough. The popular for the time Electronic Games magazine had just released its 4th issue on the 11th of June 1982, and Pac-Man, or at least the 2600 version of Pac-Man, was reviewed in this very magazine.
Alright folks, first the bad news about the most eagerly waited video game of all time. Atari's VCS version of Pac-Man neither looks nor sounds anything like the coin-op original. The graphics are clunky and unsophisticated. There are no changing bonus items such as cherries, limes, keys, but simply an orange square with a blue dot inside. And the sounds, except for an inappropriate metallic boing whenever the gobbler consumes a pill, are virtually non-existent. Joystick response on all game variations, but especially Game 1, is horrible. Getting the gobbler to drop down through an opening is an ordeal. The goblins blink constantly, making them difficult to see, and their eyes do not look in the direction they are seeing or traveling, but simply rotate through 4 positions. Now, what about the good news? Well, there's finally a gobble game available for Atari VCS. Beyond that, it's disappointingly difficult to find anything positive to say about this game.
Nowadays, this may not be that big of a deal, but let me tell you, it was. Before this, the magazine and similar magazines had only ever really posted positive reviews for the games that they were covering. Looking back, these things were more information catalogues created by fanboys that couldn't get over the fact that they get to play the latest games and detailing what was going on in the worlds of arcades, handhelds, LCD games, and of course Atari home consoles too before everybody else. And it is also worth pointing out that these early magazines really do give an insight into how obsessed the world was with Pac-Man, as you couldn't really go 2 or 3 pages without him being talked about or drawn or advertised in some capacity. It was obviously a selling point for these magazines, and because of this, well, everybody knew Pac-Man like the back of their hand. They couldn't get away from it even if they tried. And Pac-Man for the Atari 2600, as okay as it was sadly created at a time when Atari's best coders had already moved on or were about to move on. No disrespect to Todd Fry, but this was so obviously not what real Pac-Man gamers wanted. And ever since, gaming media has given a bit more of a critical eye when reviewing games. And Todd himself, who, let's be honest here guys, actually created something that nobody else wanted to touch or possibly could even create, ended up creating the Sword Quest games, which reviewed incredibly highly. Also, let's not forget that he did earn himself a nice 10 cents per Pac-Man game sold, which very much made the once homeless chap a millionaire overnight. A true zero to hero story, if I ever do say so myself. Now, according to quite a few people, this was actually the start of the downward spiral that was the video game crash of 1983, 1 year later. And obviously, of course, there was a lot more to it than that. Pac-Man for the 2600 definitely did play its part. And whilst Todd splashed away his 1.3 million in only a couple of years, buying no less than 15 vintage guitars, 2 Alfa Romeos, one of which actually had a Pac-Man license plate, a ranch in Mexico, loads of new suits, and of course a whole heap of illegal substances to consume, the rest of the world was still not done with ports of the classic game. Of course, in more recent years, the homebrew community actually managed to make a good as can be version of Pac-Man on the 2600, but at the time, you had the Intellivision, VIC-20, C64, Apple II, IBM PC, TI-99, ZX Spectrum, the Atari 5200, and way more than I could possibly ever name, because if I did try and list them all off, it would instantly become an outdated list. Heck, I own 2 different officially released Pac-Man ports on the Switch alone. By this point, you can get as near perfect as you can possibly ever want for the original Pac-Man game on practically any system you could ever want to. But of course, the original arcade machine is still the best way to go, and the incredible quarter arcades come in a very close second. Right, I think we've talked about this game quite enough now, haven't we? The original Pac-Man? Yes. I think it's now time that we talk about its sequel, and to do that very thing, we need to go back a little bit from when all these ports were released, back to 1981 with the release of Ms. Pac-Man. The story of one of the earliest arcade sequel success stories actually starts at MIT. Doug McRae was in charge of looking after a pinball machine in the dormitory of MIT, and eventually with his partner Kevin Corran, they jumped into the arcade craze and purchased themselves 20 separate machines for those dorms. One of the more popular arcade titles at their disposal was Missile Command. However, those MIT gamers would soon work out how to play the game at an expert level, and because of this, less quarters were of course deposited as the play sessions extended, with every quarter inserted. In an attempt to combat this, the duo got to work on an add-on for the unit which would change certain algorithms on the original arcade board to make it harder, and would you believe it? It was a massive success. This led the duo down the path of selling these little circuit board add-ons via newspaper ads, and very quickly a business was born named GCC, aka General Computer Corporation, and the two quickly dropped out of MIT themselves because of this and hired more dropouts to help them on their rather odd journey. Super Missile Command was the name of their unofficial add-on, and as the popularity grew for this add-on, including overseas, the next logical step was to take on whatever the next big thing was.
We started working on Asteroids and Pac-Man. Work on the Asteroids kit didn't get far. For an enhancement kit to be successful, you need a large installed base, so only the most popular arcade games are good targets. Asteroids was the biggest build of any game in the USA, 77,000 cabinets, but by mid-1981, it looked like Pac-Man was going to beat that by a wide margin.
The plan was to get the Pac-Man conversion kit out by Christmas that same year, when they expected that the world would have grown bored of the Pac-Man game, as hardcore players could quite quickly understand the logical paths of the Ghost and eventually master the game. You see, as soon as you know how to take on each of the 4 mazes, you could pretty much play for as long as you want. The thrill of progressing really did drop after this point for hardcore gamers. And this team wanted to keep the challenge alive so that their professional players could attempt to master a far more difficult version of the game, which of course would keep arcade owners very, very happy. They did this by adding more corners and fewer exits. In later stages, the patterns of the ghosts were changed and even the fruit moved about. Now, these may seem like pretty simple changes, and they were, but they changed the gameplay significantly. By simply adding a random number generator to the ghost's typical patterns greatly improved the chances of them finding you. This eliminated the ability to take the same pattern over and over, as well as the ability to hide. Seriously, next time you're playing Pac-Man, put yourself into the bottom right hand corner of the T-junction below the ghost generator, and you can hide there for literally days. The ghosts will never ever find you. But that simply does not happen with this add-on, changing it from being a game of pattern memorization and turning it into pure skill. This is why hardcore Pac fans prefer the game over the original for the most part, and why it was so widely accepted as one of the best sequels ever made. However, let's not get ahead of ourselves here, guys, because before it was Ms. Pac-Man, it was actually a completely different game. Crazy Otto was that game, and the reason for its rather ugly change-up was because of a lawsuit with Atari over that Super Missile Command add-on. Now, Atari obviously wasn't a fan of these guys making money off of their cabinets, and GCC didn't really see an issue, as it wasn't rewriting, it wasn't pirating or changing up their original code, but instead they were adding to it. And whilst all of these lawsuits were going on, this Pac-Man add-on was also being worked on at the same time. However, this time they decided to, play it safe by changing up the sprites as well, which, by the way, were actually designed by using Hasbro's Little Bright toy. I love that little factoid.
You can make lots of pretty pictures with Light Bright from Hasbro.
Anyway, these legal battles dragged on, and with Atari not exactly looking all that great in the media fighting these young lads who seriously didn't want to give up the battle, they made the decision to reach out to the ex-MIT students, stop the lawsuit, and instead hire them to make games for them. This was obviously nothing but a win-win for everybody involved, and GCC used it as a way to actively sell the Pac-Man product directly to Midway, who were responsible for distributing the Pac-Man arcade original units in the States. You see, Midway and Atari were in and out of court like no one's business back then. Heck, the most popular video game ever released on the Magnavox Odyssey 2 was a game called Casey Munchkin.
When you're hungry for real excitement, munch. When you're hungry for fast action, munch. With Odyssey's new Casey Munchkin video game, it's eat or be eaten as you chase through mind-boggling mazes, gobbling up points. And when you're hungry to step up the challenge, punch. Odyssey's computer keyboard lets you program a myriad of mazes all your own. Nobody else's maze game does that. Casey Munchkin, available now. Programmed by you.
A game where you run around a rotating maze as a blue munchkin, munching munchies and avoiding the munchers. It wasn't Pac-Man, except of course it was, and it even beat Atari to the home console race by an entire year. This sort of thing was just not uncommon and was a real headache for Midway, which is why Dave Marofsky, the president of Midway, took GCC's friendly threat as a good thing.
Hey, Atari backed down from fighting against us with Missile Command, so I'd be careful if I was you. This Pac-Man booster pack, which by the way has actually proved to be more popular than your original Pac-Man game in testing centres, is not only finished but ready to be distributed.
Okay, yes, that was a little bit exaggerated, but still, the end result for GCC was definitely achieved. Midway ended up inviting them to their offices for a meeting instead of inviting them to court, and as you probably predicted, that meeting went very, very well. In the words of Hot Chocolate, everyone's a winner, baby. That's the truth, because Midway took this as the perfect way to steer clear of the biggest competition in the arcade space that they definitely would have had, and in turn made a decent chunk of change in the process, putting GCC in charge of the first proper sequel to Pac-Man. This was of course after the sprite work was changed from Crazy Otto to Super Pac-Man and then again changed to Pac-Woman after Midway suggested that the female character that you saw in the Crazy Otto animated sequences between levels should be the new main character. And with GCC now being paid by Midway, obviously agreed. So they gave her red hair, blue eyes and a bow. This proved to be a problem due to the fact that when the character ran away, or should I say up the screen, the brown hair became a large part of the sprite and she looked very similar to one of the ghosts herself. Nakamura-san was the first to notice this issue when the prototype was shown to him in Japan.
Love the concept, get rid of the hair.
Which they did, and when she got yet another name change and design into Mrs Pac-Man, and that name, well, it didn't exactly roll off the tongue either. Miss Pac-Man didn't work as the third and final cutscene showed her and Pac-Man having a baby brought in by a stork, so you know, having a baby out of wedlock, and that wasn't going to fly for Namco. So of course, Ms Pac-Man was finally agreed upon, and boom, the arcades just got themselves another surefire hit.
Hey Joey, what's she really like?
She's the most exciting woman I ever met.
Atari introduces the Woman of the Year, Ms. Pac-Man. Just like the arcade classic, 4 different game screens, floating fruit, even pretzels.
Honey, don't you know I'm more than Pac-Man with a bow?
Reach for Ms. Pac-Man.
Reach for Atari.
And when I say surefire hit, I mean it. Ms. Pac-Man almost became as big as the original Pac-Man character himself, and there's no point in stopping there, right? Nope, because only 1 year after that original we got this, Ms. Pac-Man, and 1 year after this we actually got quite a lot. But let's start off with Baby Pac-Man. Now, Baby Pac-Man is not the little squirt that came in from the stalk during that third cutscene of Ms. Pac-Man. That was actually Junior Pac-Man, and we will get to him later. Baby Pac-Man, whose artwork first appeared in the pinball machine by Bally the same year, titled Mr and Mrs Pac-Man, which by the way was actually pretty incredible, requiring you to collect move points and then use those move points to play a light-up game of Pac-Man in the center of the table, was the third entry in the Pac-Man family of games. Baby Pac-Man wasn't only going to continue on the typical arcade formula set by the games before it, but also Bally's Midway pinball side of the business too. The final game ended up being a hybrid of both genres, where you use a joystick to play a fairly typical game on the top screen and a not so typical pinball game down below on a small but beautiful pinball table. Of course, the rules have been changed up a fair bit here, as you need to earn power pellets in the pinball portion of the game to show up in the video game portion of the game. You do this by hitting the yellow bumpers at the top of the playfield that each light up a row of letters that spell out Pac-Man, and on the left hand side you have a loop that every time you pass you spell out the word fruit, which upgrades the fruit and in turn gives you more points, and on the right you do the same thing spelling out tunnel, which in turn gives you extra ways to maneuver away from the bad guys when playing on the video game portion of the unit. Sadly, it's not a game I've ever had the ability to actually play myself, as much as I would love to do that thing. It's incredibly prone to breaking down and it's incredibly rare. If you guys ever see this, you should definitely give it a go. The next year, Bally Midway put out yet another Pac-Man game featuring another character from the world of Pac-Man, this time called Professor Pac-Man. This game was trying to jump onto the rather niche quiz arcade market that had seen a small rise in the early 80s, where Professor Pac-Man would simply ask you a set of visual-based puzzles and you in turn would have a short amount of time to answer them. The game, unsurprisingly, wasn't very popular, with only 400 units being made and 300 of which supposedly being returned, which we will get to in a bit. It was a Pac-Man game by its name alone, but it absolutely featured nothing that arcade goers wanted. And then you had Junior Pac-Man. Yes, Junior Pac-Man, that Pac-Man that featured in the Ms. Pac-Man cutscenes. What's different about this one? Well, it was done by GCC, which means, again, not a lot of big changes were made, but instead a good amount of smaller ones. The main and most obvious change up was that the maze was bigger. The way they achieved this was by scrolling the screen left and right, which uncovered more of the playfield, and as GCC were still using what was available to them in the original game's code, they found fatter dots, which when eaten would actually slow down Junior, but at the same time would give him more points. These show up when your movable bonus items fly over those dots, but you still need to munch. However, if these bonus items hit your power pellets, then they will explode. Add all of this with the unpredictable nature of the ghost from Ms. Pac-Man, and you actually have a game that is stupidly hard to beat, but still pretty fun to actually try and accomplish. But it's likely that you never will. It's a very hard game. You see, what you got to remember is that even though the average player will only see the second or possibly the third maze on Pac-Man, these GCC guys made the original Ms. Pac-Man as a response to all of those people out there that mastered the game, and this Junior Pac-Man was essentially going further down that path. Pac-Man Jr. was even harder than the game that came before it, and because of that, even though the most hardcore of hardcore Pac-Man gamers may like it, the majority of gamers didn't exactly fall for this game, making it the final entry in the series made by GCC. And with that, Bally Midway had not only helped distribute Pac-Man onto Western shores, they also brought in a whole heap of other characters, including a wife, 2 kids, a professor, a spin-off pinball machine, and even their own enhancement kit, not to be confused with what GCC were doing originally. Pac-Man Plus. It was different, but not really any different than the original. The exciting new Pac-Man Plus, as the arcade flyer boasted, changed some of the colours around, the fruit around, the ghost sprites around, and even included a can of Coca-Cola, because, you know, why not? A few minor gameplay changes got included too, but they are so minor, you're not going to notice them. This brought the grand total to 7 arcade games in just a few years. Now, granted, one of those games was obviously the original Pac-Man, but did you know that wasn't all that they wanted to do with the yellow dot? Pac-Man 2 was a handheld game put forward but created by Entex and a cancelled arcade machine. The original LCD title was put out by Tomy. Count Pacula was another Finnish pinball video game hybrid that never got off the ground. There are rumours of a SEGA collaboration arcade game that brought the worlds of Pac-Man and Pengo together, although this may have just been a bootleg. It's also not clear whether Ms. Pac-Man Plus was official or not. Of course, you had the absurd amount of merchandise, including the hit single, board games, a decent amount of mini LED systems, and even a short-lived Six Flags Entertainment Playground inclusion, where you could meet Pac-Man and Ms. Pac-Man, who definitely didn't look scary with their flappy mouths. And then you had the Hanna-Barbera animated Saturday morning TV show that also featured a whole heap of its own merchandise. Mostly in Italy for some reason, although I have no idea why. Over there, that show completely blew up. And that show was actually so heavily sponsored that during its initial run, the commercial break was double the length of normal commercial breaks in order to fit them all in. And seriously, guys, who can blame them? This was just the tip of the iceberg. All of this came out within only 3 years. Pac-Mania does not even begin to explain how crazy the world was for Pac-Man during this time. And if you think Namco themselves were happy with this back in Japan, well, you would actually be mistaken. In the eyes of Namco, Bally Midway had done what they were tasked to do, but at the same time, they had gone way overboard. I mean, they wasn't wrong in doing what they did. They was allowed to do this, and it was obviously done because Namco themselves was simply taking too long in Midway's eyes at getting sequels out the door. But still, it was just way too much for Namco, and because of this, they ended up cutting ties with Bally Midway from here on out. But yet again, guys, we are in fact getting a little ahead of ourselves, because during all of this, if we go back to 1980 to 1983, or 1984 actually, even Namco were putting out Pac-Man games too. Not at the level Midway were doing, oh no. But with that said, none of what Namco produced themselves ever came close to Ms. Pac-Man, and well, for Namco, that's gotta hurt.
Check the mic and make sure it sound right, boys.
First up was Super Pac-Man in 1982. The idea in this game was that instead of eating dots, you eat food, which is behind certain gated areas for the most part. In order to do this, you need to collect keys to open doors or become Super Pac-Man, which will let you smash straight through them. You can also temporarily speed up Pac-Man to an almost uncontrollable speed by smacking the super speed button, which actually was reduced down a little bit by Bally when it was brought over to Western Shores. The maze is pretty basic by comparison to everything that we have seen before. However, because of this key mechanic, you will find yourself darting all over the screen to get to whatever random gates they may open. And of course, you gotta do all of this whilst dodging the ghosts or attacking them after consuming a power pellet.
It sound right, boys.
In more recent years, it has gained a bit of a cult following, but at the time, the Namco created sequel didn't exactly pull in the numbers that Bally Midway's Ms. Pac-Man did, which it essentially was in competition with, and because of that, it got practically no love in regards to its home console ports. The second game, and fifth overall by Namco, was Pac and Pal, very much a follow-up to their previous Super Pac-Man. The big difference was that in this game, you have to run over upside-down playing cards that will then flip over and open the locked areas instead of keys. Also new to this release is Miru, Pac-Man's pal, who just so happens to be a ghost that has befriended Pac-Man and helps him along his way collecting fruit. The only problem was the more the ghost collected, the less you collected, and therefore hardcore players will actually want to race to these items before the ghost has a chance to help out. An attempt was made to bring the cabinet to Western Shores, with the only difference being Miru being changed for Pac-Man's dog from the Hanna-Barbera cartoon show called Chomp-Chomp, but after it was sent out to several arcades, it received underwhelming profits and was quickly cancelled. Which finally brings us to easily the most interesting spin-off for the franchise besides Professor Pac-Man, and that was of course Pac-Land, the final game that was published by Bally Midway and produced by Namco themselves. Now, as stated, Namco wasn't exactly too happy with how much juice had been squeezed out of the little yellow dot by Bally Midway, and because of this, moving forward, a lot of those characters that Bally Midway brought to the arcades were completely forgotten about. But with that said, there's no denying that some of those characters were a seriously big deal. They knew better than to take Ms. Pac-Man away. After all, the original intent was to get more females into arcades, and even though the original game did that very thing, Ms. Pac-Man did it even more, becoming the Betty Boop of video game mascots and even rivaling the big man himself. On top of that, not only were some of these games outselling what even Namco could do, the TV show also proved to be extremely popular, and that's why a video game very heavily focused on the show was created by Namco themselves. I suppose it's a case of choose your battles, right? Now, Namco did obviously take some creative control with the original design, making the characters look like a mix between what they originally designed in the artwork for their games and what the Saturday morning TV show provided. In this platforming game, you have 3 buttons: left, right, and jump. Your aim, in the original Japanese release at least, is to transport a fairy who is under your hat all the way home whilst dodging a crazy amount of ghosts and jumping over them or collecting power pellets and eating them. But on top of all of this, the other big difference was that this game kinda plays a little bit like a track and field game too. You see, the more you tap the directional button in the arcades, the faster Pac-Man will run in that direction until he is pretty much uncontrollable. Not something that newcomers will want to do, but speedrunners would seriously get a kick out of. Making the smallest and simplest jumps very hard to predict and making the larger gaps a leap of faith that you're very likely going to miss on your first go. Still, if you do reteach yourself to play this type of platformer, you may actually find that you enjoy it. It's obvious as to why it didn't do all of that well back in 1984, even with Bally Midway's attempts to slightly slow it down and of course make it even more like the Saturday morning cartoon show. But still, it is a solid, albeit incredibly strange entry that retro gaming nuts find quite inspirational. Oh, and by the way, even Shigeru Miyamoto was inspired by this game's design and overall look, as he took the blue sky look of this game and put it into Super Mario Bros. So there you have it, the end of the Bally Midway years. Obviously the hype that was Pac-Man Mania resulted in even more ports of Pac-Land getting pushed onto as many systems as possible, and even the setting of Pac-Land was used in the more recently released Smash Bros games from the Wii U onwards. So what came next? Well, Pac-Man actually ended up going on a 3-year break between proper Pac-Man releases. And as Pac-Man Mania started to dwindle down a little bit, Namco decided to go back to their roots for the final Pac-Man arcade game that they were going to release. Spoiler alert, it actually wasn't the final Pac-Man arcade game release, but you knew that already. Pac-Mania is essentially Pac-Man, but now with a slightly isometric view. At its core, it's Pac-Man, but with a whole heap of 16-bit makeup slapped on top, which most definitely isn't a bad thing. The other big difference is, of course, the fact that you can jump. This makes play sessions last a little bit longer, giving you the ability to jump over pretty much all of the ghosts at once if they're clubbed together enough. But as the AI has indeed improved since the original, it can be quite the challenge in later levels to nail that down. I am personally a big fan of this change-up, and even though I obviously prefer the originals, this is still an excellent follow-up that does just enough to make it a worthy sequel without alienating fans of the original. Plus, I think it was the first ever Pac-Man game that I ever played on the Amstrad CPC. As you may have expected, a crazy amount of ports were made for this game, including endless amounts of Pac-Man collection sets, which again is nothing but a good thing. And if you ask me, even though the series has definitely had a few low points, this game was the perfect way to round off Pac-Man Mania. By this point, the heydays were over. Of course, it wasn't the last we would see of the little yellow ball, but I think it's fair to say that he has hit his peak here. What Namco was able to produce, and of course Bally Midway were able to promote, was something truly special. It was a game that even to this day is pretty unbeatable when it comes to recognition. This final game signals the end of an era. Sure, it was technically a 16-bit game, however, what came next was a new path for Pac-Man. We had obviously seen plenty of arcade ports already for home consoles, but now it was time to take Pac-Man down a very different path, attempting to take on the booming console market of the 90s and make sure the world never forgets Namco's flagship mascot, Pac-Man.
Well, they come as if from outer space in a variety of weird guises. Defender, Pac-Man, asteroids. To fans, they represent a challenge. But to critics, as Terry Drinkwater reports, they are a menace.
The year is 1993. It's been a while since a new Pac-Man game was released, yet he was still instantly recognizable. And as the world became more and more obsessed with gaming, primarily in the 16-bit era, Namco decided that now was the time to get to work bringing new Pac-Man titles to these new systems, in an attempt to keep the name alive. Sure, you had him pop up in the odd cameo, including the 1989 Japanese version of Family Pinball, and there was even a Namco-produced arcade puzzle club game that too unsurprisingly never got released or properly finished. But the real first attempt at a new game was actually heavily inspired by Tetris. Heck, the game even went under the name Pactris originally, and Namco even took out a trademark with that name. It's assumed that this, of course, was too close to the Tetris name, and in the end the game was released as Pac Attack. Now, originally this game wasn't even a Pac-Man game, but instead in the beginning days of the game's release it was using a completely different Namco property, and that property was Cosmo Gang, a spin-off to a more popular Elemecha machine that you would find in arcade centres that required you to shoot little wobbly pink aliens as they came towards you with as few shots as possible. That got changed into a fairly typical puzzle game in the arcades because why not? That then got ported onto the Super Famicom, but considering the Cosmo Gang weren't exactly well known outside of Japan, they decided to westernize it by swapping all of the sprites to Pac-Man sprites. This not only worked completely fine, but was actually arguably better than what came before it. You see, in this game your job is to survive for as long as you can and build up a nice score along the way. You can do this by getting your long lines from left to right in typical Tetris fashion, but more interestingly you also drop ghosts too, and the real aim of the game is to try your best to create a line of these ghosts so that when you do eventually drop Pac-Man, he can fall down and hopefully complete a ghost path and take out everything in his way. When it comes to these super simple puzzle games that are obviously inspired by Tetris, they're obviously not as good as Tetris, and this game is obviously not as good as Tetris, or Pac-Man for that matter. However, it is a good game, and you will want to keep coming back again and again to try and master that Pac-Man path. And, well, I would say this is a good contender for the not as good as Tetris crown. For Namco, it did wonders. Games like this do not take long to make, and they obviously do not take long to port either, which is of course a good thing, as it's still getting ported to pretty much every console imaginable and doing so with absolute ease. I'm playing on the Evercade, and for a system like that, it's absolutely perfect. And before moving on, it is probably worth bringing up Pac Panic, an unreleased game for the CDI that would have featured a beautifully animated intro sequence in all of its typical Zelda CDI glory. Anyway, moving on. Pac-Man 2: The New Adventures. Yes, Pac-Man is finally getting a true sequel, apparently. Although this does feel more like a spin-off to Pac-Land than the original Pac-Man game, as this is made from a side-on perspective, just like that game was. The big difference, however, is the fact that this is instead a point-and-click adventure of sorts. You see, you do not actually control Pac-Man. Your job is to be you, shooting a slingshot at the world around Pac-Man in order to help the game progress. It's a massive case of trial and error. Will shooting this thing help? Who knows? Sometimes certain events don't necessarily hurt, kill, or continue the story of Pac-Man, but instead can completely change the mood of the main character, which ultimately changes his view as you go on in the game. In Japan, it's called Hello Pac-Man, which has incredible artwork, by the way, showing a very stylized Pac-Man jump up in that typical wahoo sort of fist bump pose, whereas on the European cover, you see him on a ledge about to dive off with a hang glider all happy, and on the American cover you see him mid-air on said hang glider screaming in terror. It's really strange, but in actual fact, it makes total sense when you actually play the game. Pac-Man's mood swings jump around so frequently he's bordering on bipolar. It's a really strange entry involving you needing to complete certain basic errands put forward by Ms Pac-Man, such as get some milk for the baby or get some flowers for the neighbour, but of course it's what happens along that journey that makes it all worthwhile. The best way I can compare a game like this is it's trying to do for the point-and-click adventure genre what Pikmin did for the RTS-type genre. Taking something that pretty much everyone will agree is 100% better on a computer, or at least with a mouse, and getting that formula to work with a controller. Did they pull it off with Pac-Man 2? Well, actually, kind of. The game does a good job of letting you know how Pac-Man feels with his incredible animation, something that is very common in that genre. But even that can be odd, and few of the action-based sequences can feel quite rough around the edges too, and you will be completely dumbfounded for a lot of your playthrough of this game.
So, you got friends, but imagine if you had one special friend.
Hi, I'm your buddy.
One that would do anything for you.
Here, drink this. Chewy. Wear this.
Well, you can with Pac-Man 2, the cool interactive cartoon. He's your best pal, and no matter how much you abuse him, he'll still come back for more. So get Pac-Man 2 for SEGA and Super NES.
Get the box.
I mean, what are friends for?
In my opinion, you shouldn't believe the hate when it comes to this game. This is actually a game that's definitely worth trying, just to experience what it was like when Namco was happy to experiment with their flagship mascot. Sadly, it never got a sequel because it does feel like the first step to something much, much better. And speaking of mixing things up, Namco wasn't done yet, as the very next game did that very thing. You see, the year was 1995 by this point, and whilst Namco was busy with the first of its PlayStation Museum compilations, those are the games that each spell out a single digit of the Namco name, by the way, on the Super Nintendo, we got another side-on Pac-Man game. However, this one was titled Pac in Time, and again, it wasn't entirely original. Long-time viewers of the show would have noticed that this is actually a sort of reskin, or a reimagining if you will, of a game called Fury of the Furries, a follow-up to Squeak, which I have covered in the past on the Complete History show. However, it isn't exactly a copy of the game's layout, but instead a copy of that game's mechanics, and that's fine, because both games are actually pretty damn good. In the game, you control Pac-Man, obviously, and you need to use a sort of slingshot to swing around the game's maze-like levels. It's tough to master, but super addicted if and when you do. Your job is to find 30 pellets in each level before the exit door opens up, and you do this by swinging around, getting what you can, and eventually going through different coloured rings that give you new abilities. Green gives you the swinging rope ability, blue lets you swim, red gives you a hammer to smash through into other unreachable areas, and yellow lets Pac-Man shoot fireballs. Of course, the power pellets are here too to help you fend off the ghosts along your way, but other than that, well, that's it. It's a very basic idea that's crazy hard to master, but again, when you do, there is actually a lot to like about this game. And hey, if you actually do complete a game like this, then you can just go and pick up Fury of the Furries, which, as stated, is more of the same. And of course, it wasn't the end of Pac-Man on the 16-bit machines, as we also had Ms Pac-Man return for a port of her classic game, and although I am trying to shy away from port talk in this documentary, otherwise it will quite literally quadruple its length, what I will say is that this port is simply excellent. Again, released on the Super Nintendo, and even more of the museum collections were put out on the PlayStation 1, this title is very much an overhaul, and according to many, is the superior version to play, even over the original. And as stated, many people see this as either the greatest sequel of all time, or even possibly one of the best arcade games of all time. Personally, I'm not in that camp, but as it has so many hardcore followers, I think it's definitely worth taking a look. Which is exactly what I'm going to do after another bit of confusing history. The game was originally ported by Tengen in 1990 for the NES, and as you may know, Tengen, a subsidiary of Atari, created the company to get around Nintendo's strict policy of only releasing a few games per year for the system. Tengen did just this. They released a few, but then behind Nintendo's back worked out how to get around the security chip of the NES and release games themselves without paying royalties to the Big Red. Ms Pac-Man was one of the earlier unofficial releases, not to be confused with Namco's own offering, which came out a few years later, which is not as good, and obviously both versions are not as good as the 1991 officially licensed Sega Genesis / Mega Drive release, which is of course the best. Come on. And obviously that version is also better than the Master System port, also created by Tengen, which is surprisingly different than the Game Gear port, which was done by Namco again, and just like Namco's NES port, it's nothing special. But thankfully, the officially released Super Nintendo port, which came out a few years later, which is the same as the Mega Drive / Genesis port, besides screen resolution of course, is actually a brilliant game. And well, what's all the fuss? Why am I bringing all this up as well as the arcade original? Well, firstly, the graphics have been boosted up a fair bit here. The screen now scrolls up and down, which isn't too much of an issue if it wasn't for the multiplayer, which is actually a brilliant addition. However, you do need to work together in this game, because if one of you does fall off the scrolling screen, it's very likely that you are going to lose the game. The game has several different difficulty levels and 36 maps in total. Some of the earlier ones are noticeably easier, but the challenge soon racks up. In my opinion, if you have one of these 16-bit machines, this, due to it simply being a Ms Pac-Man port in most people's eyes, is actually a bit of a hidden gem, and you will be surprised at how addictive this simple little title is. Whoa. Right, let's go back to the arcade, shall we, and go take a look at the awesome SU-2000 and SU-3000 arcade units. Yes, as the home console market quickly catches up with the newer 3D advancements in the arcades, it was of course arcade developers' jobs to show what these massive machines can do that your little grey PlayStation boxes at home simply couldn't. The SU-2000 and SU-3000 were essentially one of the earlier all-purpose arcade machines that made virtual reality readily available to arcade owners. The problem was, these machines were not very popular. Still, a Pac-Man game in VR called Pac-Man VR was indeed made for these systems. Sadly, it was never released. Very little is known about this game other than the fact that it is the original Pac-Man game, but in VR. Very little is known about this title, even though it has in more recent years actually been released officially by a company called Virtuosity, who obtained the rights, and you can actually go and buy it yourself for $100. The problem is, it was never ported. This $100 you're about to spend will only be for a game that only works on the SU-2000 and SU-3000 arcade virtual reality machines. And considering it was never finished, this is probably just a demo. The company behind this machine were none other than Virtuality, who had already had experience in this field with Sega on the incredibly rare Tech War arcade unit, and from what I've heard, it was hard to control, albeit an impressive for the time experiment that honestly has been redone a million times over by game makers for all of you standard VR headset owners. So, you know, just go and play one of those instead if you're interested in Pac-Man in first person. Which brings us to 1999, and home console gamers and home computer gamers could pretty much play Pac-Man on the majority of those systems. And whilst Namco was still pumping out Mecha machines left, right and centre at every possible chance that they could, one game that seriously does not get enough attention is Pac-Man Arrangement, a game that was released in the arcades as a vertical game on the Namco Classic Collection Volume 2, and thankfully, this one has also been ported to a whole heap of collection sets. This game is a pretty decent overhaul of the original game. It features a new ghost called Kinky, yes, Kinky, and although at first glance this ghost doesn't actually do much more than act as a walking power pellet, meaning that when you eat them you can chase the others down, but they also, if left alone for too long, can actually upgrade the other ghosts with new abilities, allowing them to charge, jump across the screen, duplicate, spit out more dots for you to collect, and basically be a huge pain in the eye. The stages and sprites have all been revamped here too, and Pac-Man himself even gained a few new abilities, being able to charge himself when going over certain sections and going up against a much bigger ghost at the end. Pac-Man Arrangement took what the original did, and Pac-Mania 2 I suppose, and really developed on that formula. Sure, it's completable in probably less than an hour, but I think it is definitely worth checking out if you've got an hour spare. Also guys, this game is not to be confused with the Pac-Man Arrangement that came out in 2005, which of course we will get to shortly. Yep. It's time for yet again Namco to jump into yet another video game generation with their flagship mascot Pac-Man, and just like they did with the 16-bit generation, they're going to be changing it up quite a bit, and what better way to do that very thing than to jump onto the platforming bandwagon. And when I say platforming bandwagon, I mean the 3D platforming mascot bandwagon, even though 3D platforming mascots by this point had been around for quite a while. Jumping Flash and Bug came out in 1995, Super Mario 64 and Crash Bandicoot came out the next year in 1996, Croc and Jersey Devil came out in 1997, Sonic Adventure and Spyro hit our shelves in 1998, and by the time of this next game's release in 1999, you had Earthworm Jim and even Donkey Kong making the leap to 3D, for better or worse. It's fair to say that the platforming boom wasn't quite what it was during the 16-bit era, but there was plenty of gamers out there, myself included, that craved these platforming games, and well, Pac-Man was still instantly recognizable, so obviously he was the perfect choice to put into a 3D platforming game. It was only a matter of time before someone took the role of making a new game in the franchise, and of course that exact thing happened. A small team within Namco Home Tech were close to completion on whatever game they were working on in 1996, and whilst they finished off their work, the design team were tasked with making a new game. They got to work creating 4 pitches based on Namco properties and a further 4 pitches that were completely original ideas. After meeting the head of the studio, the 4 original ideas were scrapped and the team went back to further elaborate on the 4 Namco properties. You had a game based on Namja Town, which is a Namco-run Japanese arcade. You had one based on the horror brawler Splatterhouse. You had a new RPG that would feature the majority of Namco's flagship characters, and of course, you had a 3D platforming Pac-Man game. And even though the team wanted to make the RPG, the boss man wanted them to make a 3D Pac-Man game, which is exactly what they ended up doing. Bill Anderson was the guy put in charge of the small team, and he seemed like the obvious choice, working on plenty of incredible Mega Drive and Genesis titles such as Global Gladiators, Aladdin, Cool Spot, and The Jungle Book. Bill, just like everybody else, obviously wanted to take inspiration from the already released and utterly brilliant 3D platformers of the mid-90s, most notably Mario 64, but there was quite a big and very strange obstacle in their way. Japan was very worried about what Westerners would do with Pac-Man, so even though they were making a Pac-Man game, they were not allowed to use Pac-Man. This led Bill Anderson to come up with a story where a bunch of kids were teasing a younger kid at the arcade, pushing him away from all of the big gun-filled titles and telling them to beat it, we were here first, go play Pac-Man. Unhappy with this, but with no other games to play, he reluctantly does this very thing whilst ripping on the game's simplicity. The ghosts inside hear all of this mugging off and inform the leader of the Ghost Lord, who was based on the Mesmeron character from the Hanna-Barbera cartoon series, and he decides to suck him into the arcade machine with a pixel cannon, turning the player into Pac-Man, but not really Pac-Man, because he's actually a teenage lad who doesn't like Pac-Man, which has got to be the worst lead character in a Pac-Man game. But still, what other choice did these developers have? The game would have featured 14 open world themed areas after all of your typical platforming settings like ice worlds, desert worlds, spooky house worlds, temples, all that good stuff. And because you are in an arcade machine, not Pac-Man would not only fight the typical ghosts but also computing components such as capacitors, batteries, transformers and SCSI leads. And this game eventually got to about 40% complete before it was shown off at trade shows, and also to the boss men at Namco, who hated it. They fired everybody involved instead of the 3 main characters, scrapped the entire thing and told them to rework it. And rework it they did, even though plenty more hand-holding was indeed done until the finishing point and the new team released the game in late 1999, and it actually reviewed very, very well. Pac-Man from Pac-Man World has got himself a few new moves. You got a rev up dash mode, you can do this whole bouncy butt move too. It's pretty basic in all honesty, using both these moves to gain access to areas that a simple jump will not reach. And of course, because it's Pac-Man, the game has a whole heap of collecting going on too. And fair play, after all, he was one of the first to do this, right? The more dots and fruit you collected, the more points you get, just like before. These then get changed into new lives, and well, that's it. Yes, it's basic, but so was Pac-Man in the beginning. This is still a great little platformer. Sure, it's a tad rough around the edges. I mean, it was released in the UK at least 20 years after the original, and that just so happens to be over 20 years ago already. Damn, am I feeling old? I remember when my sisters bought this game new when it came out. Pac-Man World is a solid entry and a great revival for the series. It did what the 16-bit generation tried to do and completely butt-smashed it. In fact, when this game was shown off at trade shows, Scott Rogers, one of the main people working on the game, actually remembers people coming up and relating the gameplay experience to the original Pac-Man games rather than what came out on the 16-bit generation.
It was pretty cool to work on Pac-Man World. The greatest thing about being involved with it was when we were showing it at E3. Everyone had a Pac-Man story that they wanted to share, about how the original Pac-Man was their favorite game, or how they stole quarters from their mom to feed their Pac-Man habit, or how they loved the cartoon from the 80s. Pac-Man is like an old friend, and everyone got really excited about the game, and it felt good to be a part of that. A lot of people don't know about or remember Pac-In-Time or Pac-Land or any of the other Pac-Man platform games that preceded Pac-Man World. All they had in their collective memory was the original and Mrs. Pac-Man, so we had to live up to the original, and that was a tough act to follow. However, I think in the end, we were pretty successful.
Another interesting throwback that they added to the game was the mini levels based on the original top-down Pac-Man levels. And although these obviously do not play as well as the originals, it's yet again the perfect combination of merging the old with the new. It even has a couple of cameos thrown in for good measure, including a Gallagher-inspired level, a Puka from Dig Dug due to his immense popularity in Japan, and the final boss is a character called Toc-Man, which spelt in reverse is obviously Namcot. Nice. Following on from this, we have Ms. Pac-Man Maze Madness, and even though the top-down sections of Pac-Man World were surprisingly the weakest parts of that game, this game is nothing but those top-down maze-like levels. However, quite a bit has changed here. Yes, you still gotta munch the dots and you still gotta dodge the bad guys, but now you can stop and take your time, and more interestingly is the fact that these mazes are way more puzzle heavy. For fans of the original games, this is surprisingly one of the best follow-ups. It's instantly understandable and easy to work out what you need to do. Tackling those later puzzles can be a real head-scratcher. However, it never gets tiresome. The game really is a joy to play, and fair play to the old girl, because this game was also sponsored by Namco, not Namco. Let's not get those two confused. Namco are an organisation that helps spread the awareness of breast cancer, which again obviously is nothing but a good thing. In fact, this whole let's use arguably the most iconic female in all of gaming to promote breast cancer awareness thing continued on for a long ass time. Most notably in 2014 when your mobile featured 60 new mazes for Ms. Pac-Man to chomp her way around in. Again, nothing but a good thing. Now if only they used Pac-Man to help spread the awareness of testicular cancer. I mean, the man even looks like a pair of... Sadly, what was not so good was the fact that Ms. Pac-Man Maze Madness 2 which was obviously a follow-up to the 2000 game, did start development but sadly never got released. There are rumours that this game was cancelled due to it being based around about the time that Bandai and Namco were merging, and Bandai Namco didn't think the world wanted a new game in the Pac-Man formula. However, the validity of this claim has actually never been proven, so take that with a grain of salt. All we do know is that this game was never released, and that sucks. But never fear, time to dry your eyes, mate, because in the year 2000 we did get one final game before the world of mobile gaming opened up and gave us even more Pac-Man related games than we ever knew what to do with. The first game was Pac-Man Adventures in Time. Honestly, I'm not going to spend too long on it. It's a PC game created by Creative Asylum and Mind's Eye Productions. What you got here is basically a load of toned down Maze Madness levels, as in the typical maze levels without the puzzle mechanics. It has a few very basic Mario Party-esque levels in between, but that's about it. Perfect for people that wanted the best 3D maze-like levels that include Pac-Man himself, no real bells or whistles to this one besides the rather good overall design of the game. Get it if you really want more of the same, and keep your expectations in check with this title. Right, on to 2001, where the Adventures in Time game actually got itself a sort of sequel. Ms. Pac-Man Quest for the Golden Maze was pretty much the same game, but obviously taking its settings from Maze Madness. And the only other thing to mention here is that this is possibly the only Pac-Man game ever released to not feature Pac-Man himself. Also, this same year, we also got the very first Pac-Man mobile game that wasn't a typical port of the original Pac-Man game, called Pac-Match. This one is simply a rebranding of a game called Chain Shot from 1985, which just so happens to be what the game is called in Japan. And although it's virtually impossible to find nowadays, a Flash sequel called Pac-Match Party was released, which is essentially the exact same game and is still available. And whilst on the subject of Flash games, or at least Pac-Man Flash games, the very first Pac-Man Flash game was a game that was heavily focused on track and field, and it's as basic can get. Now, I'm not going to cover every single Flash and mobile variant in this video, as it will essentially take over the rest of the video. However, I will continue to drop in and out of the more notable titles that are worth mentioning, just like All I Want to Do Is Dance, which was used to promote the 2002 game Pac-Man World 2, which thankfully segments us perfectly into Pac-Man World 2. Which was unsurprisingly even more of the original. Now, unlike the original, this game was actually designed to be an open world game where Pac-Man could put on different types of shoes that made his control scheme work differently, such as rollerblades and flippy floppies. Collecting fruit could be turned into smoothies to give you more powerful power-ups similar to the Resident Evil titles. But of course, this all changed again to make it more like the original. Turns out that plenty of people loved the original. In fact, it sold over 1 million copies, so of course a sequel was well underway. And considering this game ended up being a multi-platform game compared to the original PlayStation 1 release, it thankfully was able to get into the hands of even more fans. Most people's memories with 3D Pac-Man games actually start here, but for those that played the original, there really isn't much to add. The second game is just like the first game. Obviously, with it being on PlayStation 2, it not only sold better, but was also way more refined. You got a much wider open space to explore on each level. However, the game does still try to take you down one singular path, and it does a good job of it. The controls and camera has also come a long way too. In short, if you like the original, then you're probably going to be liking the sequel. Yes, this game did very, very well. In fact, it became the PlayStation 2's 56th best-selling game of all time. And whilst we're here, we might as well bring up Pac-Man World 3, even though this does mean that we jump a good 3 years ahead to 2005, because Pac-Man 3 is pretty much a slightly better version of Pac-Man 1 and 2, but that wasn't always the way it was meant to be. You see, Pac-Man World 3 actually started its life as Pac-Man Adventures, which was still a 3D platforming game of sorts, set in a dirty, spooky, borderline Titan AE setting, which of course didn't really fit within the world of Pac-Man. Now, that actually makes quite a lot of sense when you find out that Don Bluth was the guy behind designing the game. You know, Don Bluth of Dragon's Lair, All Dogs Go to Heaven, and American Tail fame, all that jazz. Well, regardless, after its cancellation, Blitz Games were the people who ended up taking it on, and sadly, it wasn't clear sailing from here on either. Just like before with Ms Pac-Man Maze Madness 2, when Bandai and Namco formed together, almost every single game in development got cancelled, including this one. Blitz Games just simply didn't want to give up on this title. They pleaded and pleaded with Bandai Namco, and finally they got the A-OK to finish it off, just as long as it was done extremely quickly and that no extra money was pumped into it. Blitz Games themselves had to pump some money into this game, and sadly, the end result wasn't exactly what they wanted. Because that result is a game that does indeed progress the moveset and feel of Pac-Man in a 3D space, making extra use of the dash roll and butt bounce, but also giving him the ability to punch too. Be careful what you wish for, guys. I, like many, always wanted to have another 3D Pac-Man game that pushed the character and world in new ways, and sure, we could argue that some of the levels found here are actually the best that they've ever been in a 3D game. The fighting mechanics? Not game-breaking in the slightest, but definitely not for me. Also, one last thing. This is the first game where Pac-Man speaks.
Sweetie, you're only as 25 as you feel.
Thanks, honey. You and Junior are the best presents I ever had. And you're right. I look fantastic.
Make of that what you will.
Is something wrong?
Honey, my Pac sense is tingling.
Overall, Pac-Man 3 is still a good game. It gets a lot of hate, mostly due to its setting, which feels more like one of the later Jak and Daxter games, but if you can look past it and get over the constant combat, what you have is a really solid roundup to the series. I enjoyed my time with Pac-Man World 3, sure I still think that the second entry is probably better, but considering its bumpy development, I think the end result is actually pretty interesting. Oh, and by the way, did you know that this was actually the first 3D Pac-Man game that was not released in Japan? This was most likely due to the merger, and the translation for this very heavy story-driven game would have been way too much of an undertaking, but still, I think it fits, as this was easily the most Western-created Pac-Man game to date. I doubt it would have done too well in Japan myself. Anyway, time to go back a few years, back to 2002, when the mobile scene were pumping out more Pac-Man games than people knew what to do with. Pac-Man Puzzle, Pac-Man Bowling, Pac-Man Slots, Pac-Man Casino, Pac-Man Pinball, and Space Invaders x Pac-Man. I've always wanted to play that last one. But back on the home consoles, Infogrames, who were responsible for the Adventures in Time and Quest for the Golden Maze titles, actually made a third game in their Pac-Man trilogy with the worst name possible. In fact, before I tell you about the game, let me tell you its title. Pac-Man All-Stars. What's wrong with that, I hear you ask? I mean, it worked for Mario All-Stars, right? Right, it did! You hear Pac-Man All-Stars and you think this is going to be yet another collection of classic games, and it wasn't. Because of this, the game actually got some fairly negative reviews, as it actually ended up being a top-down multiplayer dot collection game, best played with 4 players on a PC. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it would actually be a pretty solid 4-player game, but all this is a slightly advanced multiplayer mode from Maze Madness. It's as bare bones as you could possibly get, 4 mostly open spaces, not even mazes, with 4 Pac-Man characters running around, totally not worth your time. Later that same year, Pac-Man Fever was announced, not to be confused with the song of the same name, and as you may have guessed, this one is a Mario Party ripoff, and a bad one at that. It's a lot more accessible than, say, I don't know, Sonic Shuffle, playing as Pac-Man himself and several other Namco characters that really do not fit the setting at all. Those characters being Tiger and Heihachi from Tekken, Astaroth from Soul Calibur, and Rico from Ridge Racer, all in their super deformed state. It's really strange. Why they didn't use classic arcade characters like Gallagher, Dig Dug and Mappy is beyond me. The end result is a super basic board game-like game with very few mini-games, probably half of which are pretty awful to play, and after half a playthrough, it's likely that you've just seen all of what this game has to offer. In more recent years, it's come to light that the reason for the game's name is because the title screen was supposed to include the popular track by Buckner and Garcia. But due to no arrangement being agreed upon, this fell through, as did the DDR-inspired minigame that they wanted to add. What you end up with is a super rushed and downright terrible game that has actually scored even lower than the infamous 2600 port Stay Away at all costs. Damn, I hope it gets better from here on out. Thankfully, it did, although most people didn't even know that the next game, Pac-Man Versus, even existed. Why? Because originally, you needed a copy of the game, which depending on where you were in the world could have been given away in a bundle on its own or in Japan only, available via the Nintendo Club point system. You needed a bunch of controllers, of course, you needed a link cable, you needed a Game Boy Advance, and you needed at least one friend.
The game was created by Nintendo themselves this time, which is why when playing the game, you actually hear Mario himself narrating the whole thing. The idea of the game is that on the GBA, you control Pac-Man in a top-down manner, chasing or running from the ghosts, whilst on the TV screen, you have a much more zoomed-in 3D mode, where the other players play as the ghosts running away from or chasing to get him. If you are able to get this all working together, what you have is a bloody awesome little party game. Obviously there isn't really enough of a game here to sell on its own, but it's still an excellent party game that I really do wish they released on a Wii U as a digital download, as that would have been the perfect system for this game. Thankfully, the DS also got a version which plays rather great, and the Switch also has it as part of its Pac Party compilation.
But again, you will need several Nintendo Switch consoles to play it properly. Sorry. Very recommended, as is Pac-Man Arrangement. Nope, it's not the same Pac-Man Arrangement as before, but instead a sort of sequel, if you will. To avoid this confusion, several later re-releases renamed this game to Pac-Man Remix, which is probably the better game. Anyway, as stated, it's very much a sequel, or I suppose a reworking of that original game from a decade prior, except this time it's for widescreen devices, most notably mobile phones, but thankfully also for the PSP. In the game, you go from left and right rather than up and down. Sure, it may be more of the same in that regard, but it is still utterly fantastic and well worth checking out. And heck, if you've got a chance, check out its unknown sequel called Pac-Man Arrangement Plus, which was a sequel only for the PSP, only available in Japan and Korea, that rebrands a good portion of the stages and loads of other classic Namco franchises into the mix. Right, we are indeed getting through these titles now, aren't we? It is now 2005 and this IP is far from slowing down. We have of course already jumped into this era a little bit with the odd port onto the newly released Nintendo DS, and when Namco saw this thing, they knew that they had to play around with it. Gamers and developers couldn't take their hands off the touchscreen, obviously, and for Pac-Man's first true new game, they actually recycled an old idea that Namco's game director Tetsuya Shinoda came up with when playing around with an old Apple PDA system. One of those clunky touchpads that transformed your handwriting into a text with the use of a stylus. He always really enjoyed the fact that when you crossed out mistakes, the characters on the screen would disappear in a poof of smoke. This stuck with him, and he always wanted to implement it into an actual game, which was why a game was proposed within the walls of Namco, but was thrown aside due to the small audience on one of those little PDA systems. However, when the Nintendo DS came about, they knew it was time to revive this, and they did that exact thing at E3 2004. In this tech demo, you are presented with a lined piece of paper and you'll see several ghosts appear as if they are drawn on the screen. You then draw Pac-Man's iconic shape in the direction that you want him to go and start chomping, and he goes that way. However, if the ghosts move out of the way, you can draw a lined wall in order to make him change the direction, similar to Choo Choo Rocket. And you do this until the ghosts are gone. Being that this was 2004, people were genuinely impressed with this tech demo, but saw it as nothing more than a tech demo. At the same show, Namco was showing off Pack and Roll, a Marble Madness style game where you roll around a yellow Pac-Man ball shaped face on the bottom touchscreen and see him move around a 3D world, dodging or chasing ghosts on the top screen. Again, being that this was the birth of the DS itself, people that got hands-on with this were genuinely impressed that it worked as well as it did. But still, they saw Pack and Roll as a full game and Pac Pix as nothing more than a tech demo.
I didn't think this game could stand on its own, but it might make for good additional gameplay challenge in Pack and Roll. It's a really clever design and something that I've never seen before. Another notch in favour of the Nintendo DS system.
And these same impressions were felt throughout the majority of the entire gaming media that played it at the event. Everywhere I looked, people loved this idea, but saw it as nothing more than an idea. However, the director of the game, well, he apparently states that there was so much praise for these games that instead of merging them together, which was the original idea, they decided to make 2 different games. I'm sure the sales of the Nintendo DS had nothing to do with that decision. Pack and Roll came first, and although the idea is indeed basic, it actually ended up being a pretty solid title. What you have here is a game that is actually quite similar to the Pac-Man World series, with lots of open sections, with crazy amounts of ramps, of course, and just like all of the best games, your job is to collect as many pellets as possible before new areas open up, dodging and chasing ghosts. One of the cooler mechanics involves you gaining different hats that allow Pac-Man to gain different abilities. Now, rolling balls around maze-like worlds to get to the end is an obvious move for Pac-Man, and it's a gameplay style that pretty much has about 1,000 copycats on mobile platforms, let alone endless amounts on consoles, works perfectly for Pac-Man. Plus, the worlds are big enough to make this feel like a full-price game rather than a quick cash grab. People tend to really like this game, which was why it was re-released for the Wii as part of the Namco Museum Remix compilation, which in my opinion wasn't all that good. Featuring a lot of cut content and several remixes of older Pac-Man games, but not including the original. Very, very weird. As a DS game, I would actually go as far as saying it's a must-own. For the Wii, and then you got Pac Pix, which got very average scores, as most reviewers again saw it as nothing but a glorified tech demo, which it totally was. However, for a game that goes for about £5 nowadays, you would be surprised at how much fun you will have with this one. Especially if you have the Japanese release, which pumps out a little fart when you draw an arse. For the time, it's essentially a shameless cash grab, but I can't deny that I actually had a lot of fun playing with this game. You will generally be surprised at how much is on offer here. Extra drawings that you need to make get added later on, like arrows you need to draw to shoot ghosts on the top screen and bombs for clearing areas. For me, the amazement came from seeing just how much the team managed to get out of such a simple mechanic. It's super short, but it never gets boring because it ends up being quite exciting seeing what weird mechanic the devs have thought up on the next set of levels. Again, for a £5, I would actually also say that this game is a must own. I understand the criticism for the time, but considering so many developers out there were trying to use this new DS touchscreen in new and interesting ways, I would go as far as saying that this is actually one of the more experimental ways to use it, and most importantly, it actually works. Of course, when Namco established that Pac-Man could be used as a ball just like everybody else, a pinball spin-off was of course created, and this one for the Game Boy Advance is perfectly average. Look, it's not bad, but they really did not experiment with this one enough to make it worth your while. we have all played good pinball spin-off games such as Metroid Pinball, which has still got to be my personal favourite, and we have no doubt played our fair share of pretty bland ones too. This is sadly one of the bland to average ones. Sure, the simple idea behind the idea of using Pac-Man as a ball is here, and I do like the small little extras it adds, such as finding your way through a blocked out Pac-Man maze in a short space of time. But even Pac-Man is a game series that started off simple, has so much to work with by this point, and the majority of that just gets thrown out of the window with this release. The game didn't exactly sell all that well upon release, and to be expected, it got about 5 out of 10 across the board, which was why the DS sequel was cancelled. A real shame, because this should have been an easy win for Namco. Pac-Man in pinball? It's so obvious it hurts. And you know what else is obvious? Making a kart game. Yeah, he's a mascot, he's even got his own 3D platforming games too. So obviously Pac-Man World Rally was coming up next. Heck, I'm surprised it took this long. So what's it going to be? A Mario Kart spin-off that does what Crash Bandicoot did? Or a Mario Kart spin-off that does what, I don't know, Hello Kitty did? Drum roll, please. Thankfully, this game is almost as good as Crash Team Racing. Yes! It's an awesome little title. I don't know if it was because the world was getting bored with kart races at the time, which is why it got pretty average reviews at the time, but I was genuinely blown away by how good this was. Sure, it's not as good as CTR, but the amount of control you get over your karts, the weapons you have at your disposal, and the way that all of this works together just blends so nicely. Seriously, why are more people not bringing up this game? It is a hidden gem, thank you very much. It's really solid, just like the best games of the genre. You have plenty of extra modes and unlockables, including a couple of extra ones exclusive to the PSP release for some reason. And even though it did get some pretty average scores from tired reviewers, it of course sold very well. I mean, it's a Mario Kart clone with a recognisable character. They're always going to do well enough, and because of this, it actually got a sequel in 2010 on iOS devices called Pac-Man Kart Rally. Now this is more like it. A generic kart racer that's actually pretty rubbish. A kart racing cash grab. This is what we've all come to expect from the genre. Few characters that are involved in this ever-growing world, hard to use controls, boring gameplay, forgettable set pieces, and a game that is so forgettable that when it was randomly delisted from Google's Play Store, no one even realised for quite some time. And because of this, the date will probably never be known. This one is again one to avoid, which thankfully you've really got no choice but to do that thing.
Fun fact, did you know
that the original release of Pac-Man World Rally was the first game in almost a decade to fix the naming of Clyde and Blinky the Ghost, as since the mid-90s the names of these two characters had been reversed from what they were called in the original arcade titles. Yes, even the games that had those arcade games as unlockables. Right guys, we have covered a lot of games so far, but one thing that is different about this complete history compared to pretty much all of the others is the fact that the original game designer was not involved with the majority of the sequels. Well, that was all about to change with the rebirth of the series and the game that's going to take it back to its roots. Toru Iwatani was back as the game designer, and with the help of his team, most notably Tadashi Igarashi, they decided to chuck away everything that has happened over the last few decades and take Pac-Man back to his roots.
A lot of what Iwatani-san would talk to me about was the whole fundamentals of what a game is, and why a game is fun and compelling, everlasting, and almost eternal in its gaminess, its fun and entertaining qualities. The key, Iwatani would say, is that simplicity makes it endearing and compelling, and not bogging it down with extra this and that. We're just getting to the core, and making sure the core is well structured and well thought out, and will create an everlasting game or fun experience to continually replay.
That that was Nobutaka Nakajima, the producer of Iwatani's rightful return to the Pac-Man IP. What made this particular game so important was yet again the emergence of a new generation of gaming consoles. Now obviously older gaming systems had played around with HD graphics in the past, but nothing like this. To many, myself included, the Xbox 360 was my first true experience of 1080 gaming. And on top of that, the Xbox 360 also brought affordable arcade-like games to the masses. The Xbox Live Arcade service was a service that provided small bite-sized arcade-like games for anything between a few quid to around about £20. Of course, all of these classic game companies that had been around forever saw this as the perfect opportunity to release their classics, or as Tadashi Egarushi put it, their masterpiece games. And of course, right at the top of the list was Namco's Pac-Man, the original Pac-Man that yet again was ported to yet again another home console yet again. Now the problem with doing this, of course, is the fact that 1, we have all played this game before a million times, and 2, it still has a pretty big problem. And that problem is the fact that the majority of the screen is taken up by borders. Now thankfully the Nintendo Switch actually fixes this issue, but the Xbox 360 didn't. As good as the game was, it was never intended to be on a system that supports widescreen, nor was it meant to be in HD. The end result is a beautiful border that takes up over half of the screen and a small area where you play the classic game. The time to remake the classic idea of Pac-Man was now, and the team wanted to use what the 360 and PlayStation 3 brought to the table, that being widescreen support and HD graphics. This was the seed for the next project. And with the original designer on board producing what he said would be his final ever game, they collectively agreed on this new/old approach. The game, of course, was Pac-Man Championship Edition, a game that is so good Toru Iwatani has in more recent years actually stated that this game is better than his original 1980s video game. Pac-Man Championship Edition takes what made Pac-Man great and showed the world that you simply can't beat the classics, taking the point collection aspect of the game, the chasing aspect of the game, and the speed aspect of the game, and only really working with those mechanics. This game is without a doubt the best and most logical continuation since Ms Pac-Man. Reviewers love the quick thinking maze-like logic, trying to work out how you're going to take your path as quick as you can, collecting the fruit and seeing a new path which you need to quickly decipher appear on the opposite side of the screen. Doing this for as often as you can in the short time limit, and of course dodging and hopefully munching on as many ghosts as humanly possible in a nice big combo. With the majority of Xbox 360s online, never was there a better time than to show off your amazing scores that you were pulling off in Championship Edition. And sure, even though the majority of hardcore gamers were obviously looking at whatever new multiplayer maps they could get or whatever big gun they could unlock in whatever Medal of Heroes game they were playing, in the online arcade space, Pac-Man was dominating, and rightfully so. He continued to do this very thing, even with the release of the upgraded, re-releasey sort of game, Pac-Man Championship Edition DX. Yet again, a game that only does what it needs to, and because of that simple mechanic on new HD screens with neon-esque filled mazes, pumping techno music and super fast speeds, Pac-Man has never looked so good, and it's doubtful he ever will again. The sequel of sorts brings in even more ghosts and modes, again never straying too far away from the original idea, but making the whole experience feel far more exciting and intense in spots. Purposeful slowdowns when you get close to ghosts and seemingly endless amounts of ghosts sleeping around the maze creates insanely long ghost conga lines chasing you until you get a power pellet, turn around and pull off one of the most satisfying moments in all of Pac-Man history as you massacre them all. On top of that, the game is full of little nods that may look like cosmetic upgrades, but in fact prove as incredible little history pieces to Pac-Man. And as this is the complete history, I suppose I should briefly bring up the free add-on called Pac-Man Championship Edition DX Plus, which adds even more scoreboardy goodies and loads of DLC content such as reskins for other classic Namco franchises. It really is easily one of the best games on this entire list. Now, whilst talking about these DX and DX Plus games, we've actually jumped forward a few years here, because before those games and after Championship Edition, we actually got a whole heap of new Pac-Man games. Pac-Motos is a part of the Namco Museum remix that blends together the worlds of Pac-Man and the arcade classic Motos. It's a top-down ball-like game where you move around a floating square board, knocking projectiles off the playing field until you are one of the only ones left. It's basic and it works, mostly because the game is essentially a reskin of the 2006 Japan-only PSP game Moto's Arrangement. Literally, the exact same game, bosses and everything. Pac-Man Pizza Parlor is, yes, something that actually exists. A PC-only game that tells the story of a random old pizza owner guy who gets spooked by a Pac-Man ghost, falls down, hits his head, loses his memory, not even knowing who his own daughter is at the hospital. He then tells her to put a quarter in the old Pac-Man arcade machine that's in storage. She does that very thing. Pac-Man jumps out of the arcade cabinet and the daughter plus Pac-Man duo then work together to run the pizza parlor. Everyone's happy, except for the dad, who's obviously suffering with dementia. The way it works is that in this game, you control both Pac-Man and Kathy at the pizza parlor in a time management game. People order stuff at the counter, and you need to click where you want Pac-Man to go in what I assume is the kitchen, who will then shoot that food to Kathy's side of the screen, where she will need to either serve it up straight away or put it in the oven before cooking it. The story gets ridiculous as you try to uncover more things for your forgetful father, and you quickly realise that he has loads of debts and loans, so you end up working doubly hard to pay them off, making more elaborate meals to as many customers as you can in a short space of time. What this all has to do with Pac-Man, I'll never know. I mean, maybe it's got something to do with the fact that the pizza is part of his creation, but then again, I never actually got anywhere in the game where this was ever mentioned. Who knows? However, guys, I will say this. Pac-Man Pizza Parlor is actually a pretty good game. Yes, mobile gamers have no doubt played millions of games like this. It doesn't really bring anything new to the table in that regard, but I can't deny it, guys. I thoroughly enjoyed my time with Pac-Man Pizza Parlor. Don't judge me. Look, I'll probably get bored of it after a few more turns, but right now, all I want to do is go back and play more Pac-Man Pizza Parlor. Anyway, next up was Pac-Man Party for the Wii, which of course is yet again another Mario Party ripoff, but surprisingly, it too is actually pretty good. Sure, it starts off a little slow, but as the game is heavily focused on you collecting sets of items around the game in a Monopoly-style setting, it actually gets quite frantic quite quickly. Plus, the board and minigames themselves are for the most part pretty speedy and quite well done. For me, it could possibly be better than some of the later Mario Party games themselves, but of course, not as good as the classics, which you would obviously find on the GameCube. Go in with media expectations like I did, and you might actually be pleasantly surprised with this title. This also got a port a year later for the 3DS, which sadly isn't as good. The minigames themselves are quite fun. I wouldn't go as far as to say the actual board gamey side of things is much fun at all. Which finally brings us back up to speed. 2010, the 30th anniversary of Pac-Man. A lot of the games mentioned so far actually came out this year to celebrate the little yellow dot's birthday. And also, Google did the iconic Google Doodle, which was an actual playable version of Pac-Man around the Google logo. You can actually still find that and play it, by the way, by simply searching for Pac-Man. In Japan, he got an exclusive crossover game with Bomberman, Pac-Man X Bomberman, which sounds amazing, although is sadly no longer available to actually play. And of course, he finally came back to the arcades with, wait for it, Pac-Man Battle Royale. Do you remember when people were sick of yet another Battle Royale game until Nintendo came along and did it right? Well, move aside, fanboys, because Pac-Man got there first with this bloody awesome Battle Royale game that is definitely one of the ones you should go and try. It's pretty simple in this arcade title that was the first released in 14 years, I might add. You control one of 4 different coloured Pac-Men in a maze collecting as many fruits and darts as possible. However, if you get a power pellet, you'll blow up in size temporarily, similar to Super Pac-Man, and then this gives you the chance to not only eat the ghosts, but your opponents too. The real winner is the one at the end that has the best combination of all of these things. It is awesome. Pac-Man Tilt is a side-scrolling platformer that lets you quite literally tilt your 3DS console in order to manipulate the world around you. It's pretty basic in all honesty, fun for what it is, but you will soon get bored of it. Most of the levels, as pretty and neon-filled as they do look, are actually all very, very similar. And unfortunately, the novelty of tilting the 3DS to simply get up a slightly out of reach ledge does get boring before it gets fun. And this was the same year, that's 2013 by the way, that Pac-Man got himself yet again another new show. Pac-Man and the Ghostly Adventures is a show that my son has actually watched a few times on Netflix, and even though this seems like a failed reboot in the same vein as Sonic Boom, it actually is pretty good. The show does what it can to appeal to kids whilst fleshing out the rather simple world the game provides. Pac-Man is a kid now, and one of the new ghosts, who looks like an Avril Lavigne wannabe, secretly has a crush on him. Along with his new friends and family, it's up to Pac-Man to save the day from other ghosts, which are obviously the bad guys. It's all very, very basic and nothing I've ever really had too much interest in watching. If my son's watching it, I'll check it out, and he quite likes it. It done well enough to get 3 seasons and 52 episodes, and of course, a whole heap of video games. Firstly, you got the game with the same name for the Wii U and eventually other systems too, which is of course a 3D platformer based on the show, which is in itself loosely based on the World series, which is based on the arcade originals. You keeping up? I've never played this game before this review, and I don't know, maybe this is the dad in me, but for a game that I would let my son play, it's again actually pretty good. It's similar in the way the earlier World games play, you know, collectibles, platforming, all that good stuff. But unlike those games that actually provide a decent level of hard platforming, this one is a little more aimed at a younger generation, which again, for this kind of game, is fine. Seasoned 3D platforming fans will find it easy, but I doubt you'll ever get bored. It's a surprisingly polished game for youngsters, and actually pretty good gameplay-wise too. I mean, the story is terrible, completely forgettable in fact, but the main core of the game is perfectly above average. Put this in the hands of its target audience and they should find enjoyment in it. Unlike the previous 3D games, this one has plenty of power-ups that actually relate to what happens in the show, or at least I'm told, and this thankfully gives Pac-Man some neat new moves for a short while that any 3D platforming fan will get to grips with instantly. Overall, the game is a perfectly fine 7 out of 10 game. It's nothing more than that. It's perfectly above average. Of course, being that it was a platformer based on a kids TV show, a 3DS version was right around the corner, and surprisingly this one is actually quite different, being that it's more of a 2D side scroller. Again, it's as standard as they come. It definitely isn't as appealing as the console version. Pac-Man has the same kind of move sets as Yoshi, doing that little kick run thing at the end of his jumps, but feeling a lot more weighty. Like the console games, there is fun to have here, it's just a shame that it doesn't push the formula as much as it perhaps should. Unfortunately, very little gets changed up with this title, and again, it's another perfectly fine 7 out of 10 type game. And again, the same goes for its sequel, which literally adds nothing new to the game whatsoever. It's the same game, but with different level layouts, some of which are the same locations, so it feels more like an upgrade. Again, kids might like it, and it does play perfectly fine. The problem is, nothing is memorable in the slightest. It looks pretty and bland at the same time. Did I enjoy my short time with it? Yeah, sure. Enough to give it a 7 out of 10 again at least. Maybe slightly less than my son actually by this point wasn't all that bothered about this game. Right, finally time to get back to the good stuff again, because we've only got a few games to go, guys. Yes, we have nearly covered every single Pac-Man game. And this one, yet again, takes inspiration from the incredible original. How many people look at the original as an endless game? Of course, most players, myself included, can never really get past 2 or 3 mazes before they run out of lives. But one of the more interesting discoveries to be found in the game is that if you are good enough, you can actually beat it. Getting to level 256 may take a few hours, but when you do get there, the game simply can't handle it anymore and essentially breaks. This bug became so popular that many games and different media formats actually showed homage to that particular glitch. Like the end of Wreck-It Ralph and the 256th level on the Google Doodle. Yes, the glitch is actually in the Google Doodle. And this was when Hipster Whale, who were riding high on the success of their mobile game, Crossy Road, contacted Namco to create a game based on this glitch. Now as a mobile game, it's great. It genuinely is. For those that complain that they wish they could just pay a small fee to get unlimited lives rather than counting down the clock to restore them, well, they can do that very thing. But thankfully, the game proved so popular that it ended up on consoles too, which is obviously the better version to own. In the isometric game, you control Pac-Man in a maze, constantly moving up the screen, getting as many points as you can by collecting dots, power-ups and eating ghosts. Just like before, the ghosts themselves can get you, but the real challenge is in you running away from the ever-approaching 256 glitch that creeps up on the screen. It's simple and my god, does it work. The game is incredibly good. It takes a few liberties with the license, giving you lasers and bombs and chucking all of these weird coloured ghosts on the screen, but it's really not an issue. The game is utterly fantastic, a real treat to play. Just like all of the best games in the franchise before it, the goal is to get the very best score imaginable, and the best way to do it is to try to run over 256 dots without passing any areas that don't have dots or backtracking once again. It's a little tough to do, but when you do pull it off, it gives you a real sense of achievement that makes the whole thing worthwhile. Another must-own game, in my opinion. And following on from this, we got yet another pretty good game, Pac-Man Championship Edition 2, which, although is really good, is sadly not as good as the original Pac-Man Championship Edition. This time, the super fast and slick design, similar to the original, is bogged down a little with the power pellet path being a bit too obvious. It's not always easy, but considering in this title you can actually ricochet off the ghosts before they attack you, it actually takes away some of that traumatic on the edge of your seat gameplay that the original crafted so well. That's not to say it's a bad game, it's really not a bad game. Every time you jump to the next screen, you get a good look at what's available to you. You then shoot around the maze with crazy speeds to super fast techno music, and when you finally do take on the super long chain that you've been building up, it's immensely satisfying. Again, not as good as DX Plus, but still a rock solid entry. Pac-Man Party Royale is a follow-up to the arcade Battle Royale game, and besides the now overly cute and floaty design that Namco decided to give these characters, the game is again pretty rock solid. If you have 4 people to play with, that is. Again, it's simply the last ghost standing. However, to make it more interesting for the players that drop out early by getting attacked by ghosts, in this game, when that happens, you turn into the ghosts. If you attack another Pac-Man while in ghost form, then you come back as Pac-Man. It's a nice addition. Also, you all start the game at a slow pace. The more pellets you eat, the faster you get, which again is a nice little touch. I doubt this one will last forever as it's an Apple Store exclusive, so I suggest that you get playing this one whilst you can. Which finally brings us to the final game. Yes, the final game in the entire Pac-Man list of video games. A game that is actually not too dissimilar from the original Pac-Man, but is actually the very best of the Battle Royale series of games. And yeah, also probably the very best multiplayer Pac-Man game too. There is just one problem, and I'll get to that in a little bit. Pac-Man Mega Tunnel Battle is incredible. You fly around a fairly typical, although beautifully stylized to your taste maze, dodging ghosts or chasing them when you get the power pellets, etc, etc. But the big difference is that 64 real-world players are playing this game at the same time, and you can actually invade their mazes and take them on too, stealing their power-ups and going back into their own maze, which you will want to complete, by the way, as it will power up your Pac-Man, which again comes in handy as you take out your opponents and try to be the last Pac standing. Literally, there is nothing wrong with this game whatsoever. It's an absolute joy to play. Of course, you need an internet connection, yada yada yada, but for what it's aiming to do, it's undoubtedly the best of the Battle Royale genre. Thankfully, this Stadia exclusive title didn't stay as a Stadia exclusive title, as when the service went down in 2020, the game went multi-platform and is now available on Switch, Steam, Xbox and PlayStation under the new title Pac-Man Mega Tunnel Battle Chomp-Champs. Still, as it was released in 2020, if you ask me, it was the perfect way to celebrate the Yellow Circle's 40th anniversary. That is, of course, unless you was like me and you was able to get your hands on the 40th anniversary Quarter Arcades Pac-Man mini arcade machine, which is absolutely stunning. Just a quick interruption here, guys, because as you probably know, Pac-Man Mega Tunnel Battle is actually not the final game on the list. I'm losing my mind here because I'm trying to make a history video covering every single Pac-Man game ever released, and yet, since scripting this history video and editing it, we've had several new big Pac-Man releases. The first is Pac-Man Geo, a game based on yet another Google experiment, or at least an April Fool's Day joke, where you actually turn small sections of Google Maps into a game of Pac-Man, and, well, this is a more refined version of that. It opened up being a bit buggy and feeling a bit rushed, but since then it has had a few updates, and honestly, I mean, it is what it is. It's fun to travel the world and to see it with a new lick of paint, but as predicted, this one is no longer supported, at least on the Google Play Store. Pizza Hut did a quality little collaboration with Pac-Man that allowed you to play a 3D version of Pac-Man on top of a Pizza Hut box, and after Nintendo wowed the Battle Royale world with Tetris 99 and then confused the world by removing yet another Battle Royale game called Mario Bros 35, they instantly gained some of that credibility back when they dropped Pac-Man 99, yet another Battle Royale game. This is insane. If I'm not mistaken, this is now the 4th variant to the Battle Royale formula within the Pac-Man universe. And yet again, it's awesome. How many more times can they add a unique twist to this niche format? Unlike Mega Tunnel Battle, which is more about collectibles and attacking ghosts, and unlike Party Royale and Battle Royale, which also got a slight upgrade by the way with Battle Royale Championship Edition, which now allows for 8 players instead of 4, but is still a lot more standardized in its approach, Pac-Man 99 is seriously manic. I'm hoping that if you've managed to make your way through this insane list of Pac-Man games, that you're going to be pretty good at the game, and if so, I highly suggest checking this title out. It's so much fun, and 41 years after the original, it's still familiar and of course different enough to actually make it stand on its own. Collecting dots to make you go faster and taking out long chains of ghosts in yet again a big old conga line to then insert things that will either slow down or take out the competition gets seriously frantic almost instantly. And unlike Mario Bros 35, which honestly I never played again after I finally became the last Mario standing, this game has way more replayability for me. Hopefully this one sticks around longer, and I assume it will with all of its rather insane DLC. All we need now is for this bad boy to be released physically the same way Tetris 99 was. Since then, we've had a new Facebook game known as Pac-Man Community, which is essentially a huge leaderboard focused Pac-Man game that you play with your friends. We've had yet more compilations with titles such as Pac-Man Museum Plus, Pac-Man World got itself a respectable remake titled Pac-Man Pac-Man World Repack. Nothing too fancy here, it's pretty much almost exactly the same as the original, which as you may have guessed, shows that the game has aged a little in its gameplay, which you no doubt have come to expect with a game that's now over 20 years old. Still, for fans of the original, of which there are plenty, this was a more than worthy update that's well worth picking up. Good basic 3D platforming that's just as good as it ever was. And finally, this leads us to Shadow Labyrinth, a follow-on game based on the fantastically dark and edgy Amazon Prime show Secret Level, or more specifically the Pac-Man themed episode called Circle. Strangely, Shadow Labyrinth takes Pac-Man into the unexpected world of gory, Metroidvania styled platformers, and I cannot wait for this one. Wow. What an incredible journey. Sure, it had its bad moments, but I was genuinely surprised at just how solid this vast majority of these titles were. When it comes down to video game mascots, nobody is more iconic than this guy. And although Ms Pac-Man has sadly been a little neglected due to Namco having to pay a royalty to GCC for every appearance since her release, yes, this is why you don't see that game ported as often and why she changes her name so frequently. But considering these games are still being lapped up by fans around the world, there is no sign of Pac-Man ever slowing down, especially with all his cameos in some of gaming's most popular franchises. So, what do I say? I say bring it on, Pac-Man. We aren't sick of this little guy yet. Give us more ghosts, give us more mazes, and never stop letting us whacker our way through these mostly brilliant games. Long live Pac-Man.